Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on fostering transparency and reproducibility in research. My name is Antonio Verdejo-García, and I'll be chairing the webinar on behalf of the Young Academy of Spain, the Academia Joven de España. So this is an institution that was founded in 2019, so it's very young. And currently we have 40 fellows or academics. And we have the mission of showcasing and improving the careers of young researchers in Spain and also Spaniards all over the world, like it's my case. So it's really exciting to have this event today. We have two fantastic speakers from two very different disciplines. We have Mark Munafo, who is a psychologist and neuroscientist, and then we have Verena Martínez, who is a physicist. And both of them are going to give us their views on how to improve transparency and reproducibility in scientific research. So the way we're going to try to make it work is I'm going to be introducing each of the speakers. So first I'll introduce Mark, and he will give his talk, and then Verena, and she will give her talk. And then hopefully we're going to have some time for questions. So my understanding is that you guys can post your questions. You can log on into the YouTube channel and you can post your questions. And I'll do my best to pick them up and pass them on to the speakers. And if you don't have questions, I'll have for sure. So that's no problem either. So yeah, that's it. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker for today, which is Professor Mark Munafo. So Mark is Professor of Biological Psychology at the University of Bristol, and he's also a fellow of the UK Medical Research Council. And he is Associate Pro Vice Chancellor of Research Culture. Mark is a brilliant biological psychologist and neuroscientist. He has done excellent research on the topic, but in addition to that, he's always had a strong interest on the role of incentive structures in science and how they can shape the way science is done and the robustness and reproducibility of results. So thank you very much, Mark, for accepting our invitation today. And yeah, from now on, the floor is yours. Feel free to share the slides and take it away. We're going to switch off the cameras.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will share my slides and then I can make a start. But I appreciate the invitation to speak. And what I'm going to do is talk about why I think we need more transparency and openness in research, which will hopefully lead nicely into the second presentation. As a psychologist, I'm interested in factors that influence human behavior. And by extension, we can use what we know about how people work and think to consider how those human factors influence the way in which scientists conduct research. There's a nice quote here from this book by Nicholas Taleb, his first book, Fooled by Randomness. He's better known for Black Swan, but I think this is a better book, which captures this quite nicely. Scientists may be in the business of laughing at their predecessors, but owing to an array of human mental dispositions, few realize that someone will laugh at their beliefs in the disappointingly near future. So even those of us that work in quantitative disciplines where we try to be objective, impartial, disinterested scientists, we're still human. And we bring these cognitive biases, which typically operate unconsciously, to our work, to the questions that we choose, to the studies and how we design them, to how we interpret our data, and so on. This is a nice example of that. This is a series of photographs of a geological feature on the surface of Mars taken by orbiting satellites across 3 different periods. The first picture, taken in the 1970s, looked like a humanoid face, and some people got very excited about this and took this as evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life. But of course, it was a trick of the light. It was compounded, though, by the fact that we have a tendency to see pattern in noise. We're very good pattern detectors and often will false alarm onto what we see as patterns that are in fact not there. And it's further compounded by the cognitive bias known as pareidolia, which is the tendency to see faces in things. If you look at the later photographs, this very clearly isn't a geological feature that looks like a human face or a humanoid face. It was a trick of the light compounded by this cognitive bias of pareidolia. And so if this finding of a geological feature didn't replicate, what hope is that for those of us that are dealing with much noisier biological or behavioral data in particular, where we go into our research looking for something because we're motivated to find it, and therefore can be led astray by this tendency to see pattern in noise and that tendency to see what we're looking for, that confirmation bias, which is another well-described cognitive bias that humans possess. The other factor, which again is a factor that is well understood in terms of influences on human behavior, is the extent to which the incentive structures that we work within shape our behavior. And this quote from a survey captures that, which is that certain features of the working environment of science may have unexpected and potentially detrimental effects on the ethical dimensions of scientists' work. And this is not really talking about ethical dimensions in the context of active fraud, if you like. It's the extent to which things like pressure to publish and pressure to get grants can lead us to working in certain ways that might be to the advantage of ourselves as scientists in terms of getting a paper published or getting a grant awarded, but not ultimately to the benefit of science. In other words, the incentive structures that shape our behavior may be such that what is good for scientists and their careers is not necessarily what is good for science. And we need to think about how we can bring those incentives closer together. And what this creates in many disciplines, particularly in the biomedical and life sciences, I think, is this spectrum of behaviors that in many cases are not obviously problematic, but are problematic when they become common, and are problematic because people aren't necessarily aware, A, that they're happening, and B, of the impact of it. Things like over-enthusiastically interpreting our data, running multiple analyses, and then selecting the one that gives us the most compelling results, for example. And these are behaviors that are quite normative, quite common, but they're problematic. They lead to an increased likelihood that what is reported as a finding may in fact turn out to not be one, may turn out to be a false positive. So the challenge is that we have the scientific method, and it's important not to be too nihilistic. It's certainly still the case that the scientific method is the best means that we have ever had for identifying truths of nature. But there is an argument that the reality of how people actually work has meant that how people work is somewhat removed from the ideal scientific method. And this cartoon from PhDcomics.com, I think, illustrates that quite nicely. And we have to remember, again, that human dimension, that people become very invested in their research, very invested in their personal findings, and humans generally aren't very good at admitting when they're wrong, and particularly so perhaps when we've built entire careers on the basis of key findings that maybe turns out not to be correct. So this is a nice example of how easily we can be fooled by randomness. And the abstract that you're seeing here of this study was based on real data that were collected on real participants. It was a psychology study where participants were randomized to listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles or another kind of music. And so it was an experimental design from which we can infer causality. And what was found, what was shown, was that those who listened to When I'm 64 became younger, not felt younger subjectively, but we turned back the arrow of time and made these people 1 year younger. Now, that's clearly a false finding, but the key point here is that this is structurally very like many other experiments that you see published in the psychology literature. And the underappreciated point is that what is shown here is effectively two abstracts. You have shown in bold a condensed, curated abstract that is intended to be as convincing as possible and only show the minimum information required. And then you have the full abstract, which is more transparent, honest, complete, and which demonstrates the amount of flexibility that was built into the design, conduct, and analysis of the study. And when you see that flexibility, you see, well, very clearly there were multiple analytical pipelines that could have been implemented here. And if all of them were implemented, there's a good chance that one of them would generate a p-value less than 0.05, which is the conventional threshold used in psychology for declaring significance. And if only that one was then taken forward and put into this curated abstract, that would be a biased outcome that was much more likely to be a false positive, which in this case it clearly is. The point, though, I think, is that when we read an abstract, given that this is structurally very similar to any other number of abstract studies that we will see in the published literature, we have no way of knowing whether what we're looking at is a complete account of everything that was done or a curated version that was written in order to convince the reader. Because we rely on trust. We rely on trusting individual scientists to be complete and open and transparent and honest in their reporting. But at the same time, the incentives are to create as compelling a narrative as possible, as strong a story to get published in a certain kind of journal, so on. So that's an example of that misalignment of what is good for scientists in their careers versus what is good for science. And we see evidence of this leveraging of chance by running multiple analytical pipelines and then selecting the one that generates the most compelling findings. So in the systematic review of functional MRI studies of the brain, there were about 240 unique fMRI studies. fMRI data are high dimensional and complex. They need to go through a number of pre-processing steps before you can actually implement your inferential statistics. And there are something like 64,000 different permutations, so a very large analytical space to explore. And of those 240 fMRI studies, there were nearly as many unique analysis pipelines as there were studies in the sample. In other words, almost no two studies analyzed their data in the same way, suggesting that people are exploring that analytical space, selecting the analytical pipeline that gives the most compelling finding, and then reporting that one, which is going to systematically bias all of the estimates in the published literature away from the null and give us a very distorted impression of the nature and the magnitude of effects that exist. We also know that studies in the biomedical sciences tend to be too small. This is a systematic review by a colleague, Kate Button, who was a PhD student of mine at the time. And this demonstrated that the median statistical power of studies in neuroscience in this case, but we've replicated this across all biomedical disciplines, is about 20%. And that's far lower than the conventional 80%. And one challenge of this is that if you have a population of studies that are systematically underpowered, there is a higher likelihood that anything that declares statistical significance is more likely to be a false positive. But again, if we think in terms of incentives, if you have 10,000 euros of resource to spend on a study, or 100,000 euros, does it make sense to put all of that into a single study that will be large, well-powered, definitive, and give you a very precise estimate, but where the answer may be unexciting, in other words, not statistically significant, might be the right answer, but not the answer you were hoping for? Or does it make more sense to slice your resources thinly into multiple smaller studies, run all of those studies, roll the dice multiple times, to increase the likelihood that you will get at least one eye-catching, interesting finding that can get published in a certain type of journal? That finding is more likely to be wrong because it's too small, but it's more likely to be published in a certain kind of journal, and therefore it advances your career. Again, that misalignment of what is good for scientists' careers and what is good for science. And if we look at the quality of reporting of measures that protect against bias, in this case in rodent studies, animal models of stroke, with those measures being randomization, blinding, and sample size calculation, we can see that these measures are very rarely reported. Randomization about half the time, blinding maybe a third of the time, and sample size hardly at all. Now, just because something is not reported doesn't mean it wasn't done, but we can only know that it was done if it's reported. Again, this issue of trusting researchers to be complete and transparent in their reporting. But what's interesting is we can't even use the prestige of an institution as a proxy for quality, because when we do that, when we look at the institutions in the UK that were ranked as the best institutions doing this kind of research by our Research Excellence Framework exercise, those institutions did, on average, worse than a study drawn at random from PubMed. So these things are not well reported, and if anything, the ostensibly best institutions doing this kind of work are worst when it comes to reporting these measures that protect against bias. And we also have some evidence that the incentive structures play a role by looking at different contexts. So in the US, for example, there is much more of a culture of people's salaries not being guaranteed, particularly in biomedical research departments in Ivy League universities. So you have to get grants in order to pay your salary or to be paid your salary. And that creates a very strong incentive to write the kinds of papers that will mean that you will get the kinds of grants that will mean that you can then pay your mortgage. And in this study, Finelli and Ioannidis found that studies conducted in the US tend to have larger effect sizes than studies conducted elsewhere in the world, suggesting indirectly that perhaps these incentive structures are shaping the behavior of scientists and in turn the nature of the results that they generate. And we can see the incentives at play in this figure that shows the amounts that were awarded to first authors of papers published in different journals for researchers at Chinese institutions. And the figure only goes up to 2016 because this process has largely been discontinued now because it was creating so obviously problematic incentives. As an author of as the first author of a paper published in Nature of Science, you would receive a personal bonus of equivalent to about $40,000. And this is against the backdrop of an average professorial salary of about $8,000. So this was creating very obviously problematic incentives that were pushing scientists to effectively torture their data so that they could get into these different journals. And in fairness, This is a particularly extreme example, perhaps, but if you look at the lifetime earnings of a researcher who does get a paper published in Nature or Science during their postdoctoral career versus one that doesn't, the area under the curve of those two different trajectories adds up to a substantial lifetime difference in earnings. So these financial incentives are quite common, ubiquitous, more explicit in some contexts than others. So we assume that science is self-correcting, and again, that sort of Platonic ideal of the scientific process does include a self-correction element, but whether the way in which we actually do science leads to self-correction or leads to self-correction as quickly as we might like is, I think, an empirical question. Self-correction arises through replication, through the publication of null results, through scientists admitting that they were wrong, and all of those things, I think, happen less than we might like, which would mean that science is less self-correcting than we might assume. So to give an example of that, this is a systematic review of 83 articles in the British Journal of Psychiatry that had recommended effective interventions on the basis of a randomized controlled trial where you had an intervention against a comparator. Half of those studies hadn't been subject to any attempted replication, so a recommendation was being made on the basis of a single unreplicated study. But of those studies where there was an attempt at replication, the replication studies fell into three categories. The finding did replicate, the finding replicated but suggested that the initial effect size was inflated, and that's an inevitable consequence of applying a threshold for declaring discovery. And then you had some studies that failed to replicate. But what was interesting was that which category the replication study fell into was patterned according to the sample size of the original study, which is on the y-axis. So the larger the original study, the more likely the replication study was to replicate. And for smaller studies, there was a greater likelihood that the replication study would contradict the original study. And we can also see that we bring our personal bias to our interpretation of our data. This was a nice study which showed the same data, a heterogeneous meta-analysis, to two different groups, people who had published in that area themselves and methodologists who had no personal investment in that particular topic. And the people who had published in that area were more likely to interpret that ambiguous data set as evidence of a strong association than were the methodologists. So we see our data, we interpret our data through a lens of personal experience, of what we expect to see, and so on, these cognitive biases that I talked about. And that can shape not just the interpretation of those data, but also what we cite, how we cite it, and the networks of evidence that are created by our research. And this is an example of that. So this is a citation analysis, looking at a literature, the specific literature shown in the text. But basically, there are two sub-literatures here. The primary literature, which emerged in the early 1990s, shown in white, and then a subsequent animal and cell culture literature that emerged from the mid-1990s. Now, of the original primary data, there were 6 critical studies and 5 supportive studies. But if you look at the animal and cell culture literature, all of the citations, which are the arrows, are to the supportive studies. There's one citation to one of the critical studies, but that citation is shown in white because it was a critical citation saying, well, there's this one study over here, but it's not very good. So if you're a researcher starting out in the mid or late 1990s in the animal or cell culture literature, you would have the impression from reading the papers that you would read and the papers that they cited that your literature was based on absolutely robust foundations, whereas in fact the evidence is much more equivocal. But those critical studies have effectively become invisible because no one is citing them. One of the reasons why I always recommend to early career researchers that they start their work with a systematic review is that the systematic review methodology is designed to unearth this otherwise invisible literature. So we have a distorting effect, not just of publication bias, but also of these interpretational biases, these citation biases, so on. And we showed this here. This is the literature on the association between the serotonin transporter gene and amygdala activation. And what you see in the inside of these wheels are the studies themselves, two slightly different definitions of how we define the literature, but it doesn't really change the results. Basically, the studies themselves were reporting quite a lot of null results. By most standards, this was the literature that was doing a good job of reporting null results. So in white are the studies that did replicate the original finding. In black are the studies that claimed to replicate that finding, but in fact, when you looked at the data, it was a little bit more ambiguous. But a quarter of the studies, 21 to 25% of the studies, were explicitly reporting that they failed to replicate that original finding. So this is a literature that's doing quite a good job of publishing null results. And yet, despite making up about 25% of the literature, these studies were only cited about 3 to 4% of the time. So a very strong citation bias. And again, if you think in terms of incentives, we are incentivized by things like our H-index, the number of times that we're cited. If you know that your null results are less likely to get published, then you're less likely to write up those null results. And that's a rational choice in the context of the incentive structures that we work within. So when people talk about publication bias, I think we need to understand the mechanism. And I think the mechanism, at least in part, is researchers themselves electing not to write up their null results, and therefore knowingly distorting the published literature so that what is published is a very poor reflection of what actually was done in the field. And again, in terms of whether some self-correcting, this is a literature of 8 clinical trials for the same treatment for the same indication, thrombolytic agent for the prevention of stroke. And what you see is year of publication on the x-axis and cumulative citations on the y-axis. And the first published study was positive and indicated a benefit for the intervention over the comparator, which is good news. We have a new treatment for stroke, and the citations went up very quickly. But then there were 2 neutral trials published where there was no evidence of a difference between the intervention and the comparator, and 2 negative trials which indicated potential harm of the intervention, and they were stopped early for safety concerns. So by 2008, there were 5 published studies, 1 positive, 2 neutral, 2 negative. And then the second positive trial was published. And what you can see is that that second positive trial was cited at a much higher rate, same rate as the first positive trial. This doesn't look to me like a literature that is taking into account all of the evidence. It looks like a literature that's very much focused on positive, good news, rather than a complete appreciation of all of the evidence that's available. It doesn't look like science self-correcting. So we published this paper in 2014, making the analogy between science as it is now and the US automobile industry in the 1970s, where the focus was very much on productivity and just generating a large number of cars that would roll off the production line. There was very little in the way of quality control, and many of these cars broke down. They were known as lemons, cars that just kept breaking down because they were so badly built they could never be fixed, and eventually they had to be scrapped. The statistician, W. Edwards Deming, took the concept of quality control in manufacturing to the Japanese automobile industry, where you check a part, you put it into a larger part, you check that part, and by the end of the production line, you have a very high quality product. And the Japanese automobile industry still has a reputation of reliability today. All other manufacturing processes now adopt this approach, and as a result, all cars are highly reliable. The less intuitive insight, though, that Deming's had was that, yes, by focusing on quality, you, of course, improve quality, but you also improve productivity because you're not investing resources on fixing cars that are broken down later. And the analogy is that the way in which we produce scientific findings now is that we produce them to be fixed later, but we're not spending enough time thinking about the quality of the output in the first place, so that we have too many that need fixing, and at the same time, no incentives to run replication studies to publish null results to change our minds. So how can we improve that? This is where transparency in research comes in. There are many reasons to adopt a transparent approach to our research practices. Moral ones, such as the fact that this allows people who have ultimately funded research, like the general public, to access that research process and the artifacts generated by it. But in the context of what I've been talking about, I believe that transparency in research serves as a quality control process, partly because it allows external scrutiny of our data, of our code, our study protocols. And that means that errors will be more likely to be detected because there'll be more pairs of eyes on those intermediate steps in our research process. But the fact that errors could be detected by someone external also creates an internal incentive to ensure that there are no errors in our data, in our code. And I'm talking about honest human error here, which is a feature of being human. And we need to have processes that mitigate against that honest human error. So that transparency allows for that external scrutiny, creates an incentive for more internal scrutiny and more internal quality control. And if those assumptions are correct, then transparency in research should lead to higher quality outputs eventually. And in fact, we can see what that looks like. So there was a natural experiment in 2000 where a funder in the US, the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute, mandated the registration of primary outcomes on clinicaltrials.gov for all of the trials that it funded. So a primary outcome in a trial is the main finding that we're interested in, but often there are lots of secondary outcomes. And what can happen is that you run your analyses, the primary outcome shows no evidence of the difference between the intervention and the comparator. That's disappointing because what you hope to see, you don't see. But one of the secondary outcomes shows some evidence of a difference. And in a world where you rely on trust, the authors can choose to promote the secondary outcome and claim that it was the primary outcome all along to make their results look more interesting. Before 2000, you would have no way of knowing whether or not that outcome switching had happened. And you can see from this graph that before 2000, most of the trials funded by this funder were positive, shown as pluses, and some were neutral, shown as blue dots. After 2000, you could check. You could check the registration, which had to be in place before any data were collected on clinicaltrials.gov, and see whether or not the reported primary outcome was the same as the one that was pre-registered before the data collection began. And after 2000, most of the trials are null. A few of the trials are positive, and one for the first time goes in the opposite direction and shows evidence of harm. So a really striking difference between the two, with the main difference that occurred through this natural experiment being the degree of transparency that existed. Now, these results may look less exciting in that more of them are neutral, but I would argue these are more likely to be accurate and therefore high quality in the sense of getting the right answer. And that's ultimately what we should be interested in, getting the right answer to our questions, not getting what seem to be exciting results or what we'd hoped for. So we describe many of the challenges here in this paper that describes the threats to the hypothetico-deductive model of scientific progress and inference, and then a series of recommendations for how we can address that. Now, many of those levers are available to funders, publishers, institutions, but the one that is available to researchers themselves that any one of us can adopt is open research. We can just choose to be more transparent in our research practices, and the benefit to ourselves will be, in part, and I would argue there are many benefits, would be to improve the quality of the research that we produce. So this is a very live topic in the UK at the moment. We have Welcome, one of our major funders, doing work on research culture, and UKRI, the major government funder, doing research work on research integrity, and open research is a theme across these reports. And to promote that, we founded the UK Reproducibility Network, which comprises local networks of researchers themselves, institutional members that have a senior management lead focused on research improvement, and then funders, publishers, learning societies as part of a stakeholder group. And most excitingly, whilst this has spread very rapidly across the UK, as you can see on the left there, with our local networks as the smaller dots and our institutional members as the larger dots, we're also seeing a number of national reproducibility networks emerging in other countries. And already this map is out of date. For example, Norway recently launched its own reproducibility network. So we now have all of the major Scandinavian countries except Denmark. And you can see very many countries across Europe are establishing similar networks to promote reproducibility and open research. So that transparency, I think, has an important role to play in ensuring the quality of our research outputs. I think there's a real need for that, certainly in the life and biomedical sciences, but I would argue in many other disciplines as well. And to achieve that, we need to be working in a coordinated, harmonized way so that the way in which we do these things is consistent across disciplines, across institutions, and across countries. And if you're interested in finding out how we came about, there's an article published in PLOS Biology that describes the genesis of the UK Reproducibility Network and how we're structured. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a wonderful presentation, really intriguing and juicy. I'm sure there will be some questions to follow up. All right, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Verena Martínez. Verena is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She has a PhD in physics and bachelor training in both physics and mathematics. And her research is on experimental high energy physics and focusing on the Large Hadron Collider at CERN that apparently is about to give us some fun. She's a member of the Atlas collaboration and together with her colleagues has created platforms for scientific exchange, replication, and inspiration for both coetaneous and future scientists. Thank you very much, Verena, for accepting our invitation. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for the really nice introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So as Antonio mentioned, I'm a particle physicist, and I work at the Large Hadron Collider. So my perspective is really from sort of the point of view of high energy physics experiments and sort of large collaborations. And I just wanted to start off by saying that, high energy physics experiments are complex, and the data the results that we obtain from these experiments are rather unique, as well as the analyses that we perform on the data. And so it's very important for us to be able to publish our results, make them, broadly available. But we also, this I think also raises questions about, for example, what is our scientific output beyond papers? How can we make our results sort of most useful and benefit further from the scientific results that we have invested in? What data can we make public, and in what formats, so that we can sort of achieve these goals of having broader impacts? And just to sort of set a bit the stage and give a bit of background. So the Large Hadron Collider is the premier particle accelerator and collider at the highest energies. And we have several large collaborations performing experiments on them. So we have on one side of the ring the CMS experiment, and on the other the ATLAS experiment. So these are two general purpose particle physics experiments that have collaborations in the order of several thousand members, and essentially a significant fraction of the world's particle physics expertise, I would say, is concentrated in these experiments. We also have two other more specific experiments, LHCb and ELISE, and these are also quite sizable. I mean, the collaborations are on the order of a few hundred members. It took several decades of work to make these experiments possible. And many people had to come together from across the world. And because of the high degree of complexity, it is difficult to sort of reproduce these experiments. And so what we often strive to do is, if possible, have two experiments with similar goals in order to be able to, compare and look at the results from both. And just to, so this is, for example, one of the reasons why we would have ATLAS and CMS. And just to give you one notable example, 10 years ago, ATLAS and CMS reported the observation of the Higgs boson at CERN. And one of the really compelling evidence for this is that both ATLAS and CMS saw a similar sort of signal with the same kind of signature. So let me try to just briefly explain. So this plot essentially is a histogram of our data. That's what the data points show. And the colored stacked histogram, this is sort of our predictions for the background. And then in blue over here, this is what we would expect our signal to look like. And in the case of the CMS plot, it's sort of the colors are reversed. So the blue is the background and the red is the signal. And the fact that both experiments that use different technologies have different people involved saw the same thing was really sort of a smoking gun signal, so to speak, that for the discovery, and really important to really convince us that we were seeing something new. So what is the product of our research? So as I was trying to sort of convey earlier, there are many steps that go into not only building the experiments, but also collecting the data and then converting the data into a final result for publication. And several of these steps are very challenging and require custom-made technologies that range from, specific sensors, detectors, readout systems, software, and computing resources, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge amount that goes into producing these publications. And in order to sort of acknowledge all this broad range of contributions, we, for example, include as authors all the members of the collaboration for all our publications. So this is sort of one of our key end products, and this has always been a very important goal in the field. I was quite amused to see that even in the CERN convention back in 1953, when CERN was established, there is a specific statement in there stating that the results of the experimental and theoretical work should be published or otherwise made generally available. And so in the high energy physics community, there's been a lot of interest in going in this direction. All publications are posted, I would say, in the archive. All preprints are made available, and this has been the case essentially since the early 90s, so it goes back a long time. And several years ago, there was a major achievement with the founding of the Scope 3 collaboration. So this is essentially a consortium. It stands for Sponsoring Consortium for Open Access Publishing in Particle Physics. So what was achieved was that the goal was to take traditionally closed physics journals and make their content available for everybody to read and to reuse. And so all of our results are available online to anybody, and maybe, as I was saying before, used to extend their impact beyond just the analyses that were done originally in the experiments. And so I think that's a really powerful goal. And we've made further progress since then. So in addition to having just the journal articles, we provide several different data product types. So we have, tables with, various measurements, but we also we have figures, as I was showing you before, containing data and what our sort of simulated predictions might be. We also provide information about sort of a statistical hypothesis interpretations, so hypothesis testing for different physics models that we might want to consider. And so there's just a vast amount of information available. And so there's, in the last several years, there's also been a movement to provide digitized information from publications. And this has really been growing in the last years. There is a platform called HepData, which is a repository for all data related to publications, and it's all four of these the collaborations use them, and the fraction of papers available on this platform is increasing over time. And here you can see an example of what's the kind of information. So you can access and also in different formats, directly all the content of the figures, tables, so on and so forth. From the publication, so already digitized and sort of to make it easier to obtain. But there's a lot of interest in trying to, as I was mentioning before, reuse the results or expanding their use. And as I was sort of hinting before, the way that we typically provide results is essentially as a hypothesis testing using likelihoods. And so one of the things that often comes up is, well, at the time of when we're doing an analysis or working on a particular result, right, we might have one particular physics model in mind, but over time, things might progress. There might be other ideas, right? Somebody else might have a preferred model. And so we want to know, what does our data tell us about the viability of this model? Are there any constraints on it? Or, sort of think about it in terms of other hypotheses, essentially. And so how can we make this possible? And so this has been a topic that has involved a lot of discussion and also technical progress. The first step in this direction has been to sort of provide additional information beyond what is in the papers in the form of this likelihood model. And this is often used to, for example, combine results from different experiments. For example, if CMS and ATLAS have measurements of the Higgs boson and we want to put them together to obtain more precise measurements, this is a way to do it. But also, as I was mentioning before, we want to reinterpret results in terms of different models. So in the likelihood includes a lot more information. We also have to provide things like uncertainties, correlations between them, and so on and so forth. And this was originally stated as a goal in the early 2000s. And just, I would say, in the last 2 years or so, we've really been, making an effort to agree on how to provide this information and also actually making it publicly available in order to enable these kinds of efforts in an easier way. Now, of course, even though this has been a lot of progress, in order to be able to actually use the likelihood for combination and reinterpretations and so on, we still have to make some approximations, right? And so there is also an interest in being able to actually preserve the full analysis. So the idea here is to not have to, right, depend on these approximations and just use the likelihood, but actually rerun the analysis chain. And this requires a lot of several technological advances. In particular, we need to have ways to be able to store the software and be able to rerun the software. And there are several solutions also in industry, from industry to help us in this direction, which are really interesting. But we also need to know what to do with the software. And usually these analyses can be quite complex and have multiple steps. And so we also have to retain the information about, what is the workflow? What are the steps that we would need to follow? And so we have been working in the field of high energy physics on several platforms to enable this, how to rerun in sort of a streamlined way, and also are investing in resources to be able to sort of make this possible. And some of these things are really not obvious, right? Because you can imagine that some software program, right, that can be several years or even decades old might not work on more modern hardware, on newer operating systems, and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of, as I was saying, interesting technological problems. Of course, another thing that we also need for this is not just the software, but we also have to think about the inputs, like our actual data. And so another topic where there's been a lot of recent advances is in the field of open data. So how to provide the data from these large-scale scientific collaborations. We produce a large amount of data, and how to make this data accessible. And so the reason why this has been a bit of a sort of the source of some debate is because there's a bit of a tension between sort of two goals, right? So on the one hand, the science and the data are unique, and we want to make these widely available for the community and society at large to have greater benefits from our data. And it's also a good way to encourage interdisciplinary research. But on the other hand, it's also important for there to be incentives to keep these collaborations going. They're critical for the success of the science. And so we need to create an incentive for people to participate inside the collaboration, run the experiment, build our detectors, and so on. And so traditionally, access to data was the way to do it. So you're a member of the collaboration, then you can access the data. And of course, we also rely on the members of the collaboration to help prepare the data products and support them. Otherwise, we wouldn't have open data. So there's this sort of tension between the two things. And so, but there's been a lot of progress in terms of coming up with new policies supporting this. And we currently have several petabytes of openly accessible data available. And there's a growing industry of tools and resources available to look at this data and sort of benefit from it more broadly. So this has really been a major change in recent years. And I just wanted to make a note on what are some of the types of data and what are sort of the implications for open data. So in our experiments, we have different kinds of data. On the one hand, we have the raw data, which are really sort of the detector signals. You know, there's voltages on certain sensors and so on and so forth. And as I was mentioning before, you know, these come from highly specialized technologies that are intended to, you know, make specific kinds of measurements of the particles as they, you know, get produced in the collision and propagate through our detectors. Then we have to read out this data and process it through a software program, which we typically call the reconstruction. And essentially what we need are things like low-level calibrations of our detectors. And so this is quite an involved process. And then ultimately, in order to do analysis, what we get is like a simplified view, if you will, where what we have is we combine the information from the different parts of the detector and we have a picture of particles, okay, which is what we ultimately would use for our analysis. And just to sort of illustrate what types of complexity and refinements we have, you know, typically in these collisions, we produce thousands of particles and ultimately we're interested in just a few, right? And so there's a lot of steps going into this. And so it's typically the consensus in the community is that raw data is not as useful to be made available in an open way, and instead the focus has mostly been on sort of analysis data, or you know, sort of focusing more on this picture. So that's currently, you know, where we stand. And so far, the open data has had several very interesting use cases. So it's widely used for educational and outreach purposes. Here you can see some plots that have been some figures that have been made from open data that are reproducing some of the properties of particles that we measure in our experiments. You also have examples of analysis tools that can be used to sort of try to select different kinds of data and optimize and perform sort of an analysis. We also have displays of events to be able to visualize the data in different ways, and so on and so forth. So there's been, a wide use of these kind of resources. I mean, I, for example, have created a lab for students in the 4th year in physics to sort of be able to process some of this data and learn some particle physics in the process. And then, of course, there's also the goal of using it for research. So this is a growing area, I would say. It does require quite a bit of investment from the groups trying to, use the data in terms of learning what the content is and how to process it and so on and so forth. But there's been several very interesting studies already. A lot of them have focused on new methods for data analysis. especially coming from other fields. But there's also an interest in trying to see if it's possible to use these for real research in the sense of new physics measurements and so on and so forth. So that, but typically this is, this has been the kind of, well, most of the uses so far. So anyway, so that kind of brings me to the end of my talk. So just to summarize, open data and open science, I would say, are increasingly more prominent goals in particle physics and specifically at the LHC experiments. Part of the motivation is because it's really challenging to reproduce these experiments. And so we think it's important to share the data and preserve as much of it for posterity as possible. It's also a way to make the results more useful and broaden their impacts beyond what we inside of the collaborations can do. And we also think it's useful to be able to exchange ideas with other communities, for example, data science and machine learning communities, or other areas of growth for the future. So yeah, these are just some thoughts from my perspective. And I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Verena. That was incredible. Like the complexity involved in your work, it's mind-blowing. Thanks a lot. If you don't mind, maybe you can stop sharing the slides.
Absolutely.
And, so that we can see both you and Mark. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to keep you any longer than necessary, but definitely I wanted to fire up a couple of questions. The first one is for Mark. I wanted to ask you, you've been the promoter of a number of initiatives to increase transparency. You've been targeting journals for the pre-registration initiative, scientists themselves, and now institutions. What seems to be the policy or the strategy or the combination of strategies that is making the biggest shift in mentality and in behavior?
So I think you need, again, this is a behavior change problem, so it makes some sense that psychologists are the ones thinking about some of these issues in part. But what we need, I think, is that kind of grassroots energy, early mid-career researchers in particular, deciding to adopt these new ways of working. And we have on our website, so if you go to uprn.org, there's a section on primates that are these short 2-page documents that explain how to post a preprint, how to share data, how to share code, just the basics. And we're developing other materials, webinars, videos, animations that contextualize all of that. So getting that kind of grassroots change from the bottom up is part of it. Then institutions themselves can start to provide the training, incentivize these practices. So for example, Bristol now recognizes open research practices in its promotion criteria, and other universities are doing the same thing. So getting those incentives aligned. And then funders can start to mandate these things. So funders are now requiring data sharing, for example. So it's that combination of approaches, and that's why the structure that we have is helpful, because we can go in at the grassroots, we can go in at the institutional level, we can go in with the funders and publishers, and we can make sure it's all coordinated.
Yeah, it's definitely creating a different ecosystem. Is that right? Like everything has to be aligned to that. That's great. And Verena, one for you. Like I was absolutely thrilled by this policy of capture, preserve, reuse, and I was particularly interested in this notion that capturing the data and preserving the data is helping reinterpretation of results with new models. I was curious to know, like, how often is this happening? Let's say in your life as a researcher, how many times has happened? Like, what's been the scale of the paradigm shift that has been produced reusing data or revisiting data with new models?
So I think this is definitely an area where there's a lot of interest. We have. And it's an area where there's a lot of collaboration with theorists who are working on these models. And so, the easier that we make it for them to be able to sort of reinterpret the results, in a way, it facilitates the, being able to understand, as I was mentioning, the viability of results or of models, or sort of what are the constraints available. And so as we perform other experiments that can perhaps shed light or open some new questions, there are new theoretical developments that take place. And so it's very useful to be able to go back to the available data and see, okay, I have some explanation, right, for some observed phenomena, and now I want to see if my explanation is compatible with the information that we already have. And so these questions are otherwise, I think, more difficult to answer. And so this data, a lot of this is also driven by demand. And I would say, for example, in particle physics, the majority of papers are written by theorists, and there's a huge interest in exactly this kind of thing. So it's we hope, of course, that this will continue into the future, but that's sort of the spirit of it.
That's fascinating. And another question that I had, maybe the next two questions are for both of you. The first of them is about, and hopefully it's an optimistic response that you give me. I have noticed a little bit of a generational change in this concern for transparency, for sharing, for reproducibility. Do you think that we are kind of in the good way? Like when I talk to my junior colleagues, when I talk to my students, there is much more awareness of the need, of the advantages of going in this way. Do you have the same feeling? What are the type of things that you try to do in your groups to promote that attitude?
So, I mean, if you don't mind me starting, I think you do see a lot of interest from early career researchers. I think partly because as the conversation has become more mainstream, there's more awareness. And for someone coming in fresh without any preconception of how science works, this just seems like how you should do science, right? There's no, like, why wouldn't we do these things? So they're kind of born into it almost as researchers. That's not universal, but there's an element of that. And so we now, for example, to incentivize that, when we advertise jobs, we include in the job description that we would like to see applications from people with experience in these practices. And so that's one way of sort of generating interest. The other is that, I now say to early career researchers, there are more and more senior researchers who are aware of the need to work in these ways and need to bring these practices into their groups. So if you have those skills, that makes you very employable as a postdoc, because the easiest way for a group to bring in those skills is to just employ someone who has those skills, and then they can teach everyone else. So it's becoming a real positive to have on your CV. And for people who haven't done it before, we just start somewhere. It doesn't matter. It can be quite small. Post a preprint, complicated things like code sharing and data sharing, you can come to those gradually. You don't need to do everything at once. So yeah, just start with whatever seems easiest to you.
Verena?
Yeah, I would certainly echo a lot of the things that Mark was mentioning. I think if we can sort of make the barrier to sort of behaving in certain ways so we can lower the barriers to behaving in certain kinds of ways, that really helps going in this direction, right? I mean, if we have the platforms to be able to share code, share data, share infrastructure, I think, then it makes it easier for people to actually do that and sort of create more of these kind of incentives. And sort of what you were saying, that when you see that other publications do come out, right, that reuse your results and give you more whatever metrics you like, I think that also brings a lot of satisfaction. And so we can sort of work on the positive incentives and sort of, and the support that is needed to sort of go in this kind of direction. I think that is, another important aspect to this problem. But I would definitely say that, also with the advent of, the interest in open source code and other, related topics like that, it's a lot of this, I think, has percolated into sort of, at least in particle physics, we certainly see that, right, as a generational gap in this way.
It has, and right, and you seem to be pioneers. If in the 1950s declaration, it was already there, so it means that you're ahead of the way. And maybe my final question for both of you, because one of the missions of the Academy is not only to promote the careers of existing researchers, but also to promote interest in science and research among really young people, right? Like the ones that are finishing high school or studying university. And I think one of the exciting things that you were talking about, Verena, is can we use these open science resources to provide data for scientific inquiry to students, and in that way they can see how exciting this is? Because I remember when I was doing my degree, they just used fake data, or you had to generate an experiment, which obviously you couldn't do with your very limited resources. Is that something that you think it's also something that we should be doing, or that you're already doing, and in which ways?
Maybe I just jump in quickly. I absolutely think so. And I see that, in my, as I was mentioning before, with my own students, I think it's really exciting to be able to use real data and try things out and learn about what it really entails. And there's also just a practical matter. A lot of these experiments, it wouldn't be possible to recreate, right? We wouldn't be able to just have access to this sort of thing. And so you can also work on other aspects that are important in research. For example, how to analyze larger scale data sets, and how to interpret their significance, and doing more like statistical analysis and things like that, that maybe one wouldn't have as much time to emphasize, if you have to sort of start from the beginning, set up your experiment, collect the data, and so on. So I think there's also value to sort of trying to emphasize, this sort of thing. And this is, I think, also a generational change. There is a lot of data available out there to people, and so enabling them to know how to access data, interpret data, and so on and so forth, I think is just a really valuable skill that would also serve them well in terms of, as Mark was saying, employability and so on and so forth.
That's right.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we in our research group have published dozens of data sets on a range of different topics, but the advantage of psychology, with no offense to physics, is it's a very accessible discipline because we're all human. So many of the things we study, people can relate to. And we have had several of our data sets downloaded by schools to use in classes, in demonstrations. And we didn't do anything to make that happen. We didn't even expect it to happen. But when we looked at who was downloading our data, some of it was schools, and that's great.
That's fantastic, guys. I think that's a really bright way of finishing. I feel really privileged to have witnessed this webinar, like having these two incredible researchers, psychology and neuroscience, physics. It all came out completely seamless. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we have promoted a lot of new careers today. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for having us, and thank you to everybody for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, guys.